Good day. Dmitry Kozak, a very senior Russian official who is Russia's contact man in all negotiations concerning Ukraine, has given an absolutely fascinating interview to Russia's News 24 television channel. In it, he discussed the diplomacy over Ukraine, over the conflict in Ukraine, over the last few weeks and months, and revealed some very remarkable things. The most extraordinary thing that he revealed, in my opinion, relates to the actions of the German and French governments. But before I come to that, I'm going to say some of the things, I'm going to discuss some of the things he said about the escalation of the crisis in Ukraine, which took place earlier this year. As you will all recall, the year started with a breakdown of the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, with Ukraine engaging the breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, in shelling and counter-shelling, and with a massive deployment of Ukrainian forces to the contact line, separating Ukraine from these two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And on top of that, and beyond that, there was a major Russian counter build-up along the Ukrainian border, which terrified Western capitals and led to urgent requests and demands from the West, addressed to both sides, but primarily to Russia, to de-escalate. Well, Kozak, in this interview, discusses the reasons for this. And first of all, and perhaps unsurprisingly, he makes it clear that as far as he's concerned, the escalation, the cycle of escalation, was initiated by Ukraine, and that it was all done partly in response to Ukraine's internal problems, but also partly in response to Ukraine's various attempts to look for a solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine on Ukrainian terms. And these are some of the things that Kozak said. Ukraine is like trying to link political issues to the ceasefire. The escalation in January, February and March was evidently man-made. It has its own reasons, both domestic, political and foreign policy ones. And then Kozak goes on to discuss what the foreign policy dimensions of the escalation were. He says the following: in February, Ukraine might have decided to aggravate the situation so as to lure the United States and Britain into the Normandy format. And now the entire European Union, according to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's statement. Now, at this point, I need to explain a little about what the Normandy format is. The Normandy format is a grouping of states, Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine, which comes together at irregular intervals, often at the level of heads of government and heads of state, in order to oversee the negotiations for a settlement of the crisis in eastern Ukraine. What Kozak is saying is that the intention of the Ukrainians in engineering the crisis in eastern Ukraine this year was to try to get this Normandy format enlarged by getting the United States, Britain, and the entirety of the European Union to join the Normandy format, so that it would not just be confined to Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. Russia would, in that event, have been isolated and would have been faced in the Normandy format, not just by Ukraine, Germany, and France, but by the entirety of the collective West, some of whose members, notably Poland and the Baltic states, but also Britain, take an extremely hard line on against Russia and in support of Ukraine in response to this conflict. And Kozak essentially also says that the ultimate objective of Ukraine was to impose enormous diplomatic and political pressure on Russia to get Russia to renegotiate the terms of the Minsk agreement to enable Ukraine simply to move into eastern Ukraine, impose its own solution on the two breakaway republics, and in effect bring the two republics to heel without granting the two republics the autonomy which it is required to do under the Minsk agreement, and without Ukraine having to negotiate with the leaders of the two republics, as it is also required to do under the Minsk agreement. Well, that was one objective. The other objective was obviously to get Ukraine to improve Zelensky's popularity ratings in Ukraine itself. And this is what Kozak has to say about that. The ruling political party and Zelensky himself have seen a dramatic drop in their ratings. Since the peace pledges have not been fulfilled, it was necessary to consolidate Ukrainian voters, Ukrainian citizens, and thus the escalation began. Well, I think we all of us worked that out, that Zelensky, seeing his popularity within Ukraine collapse, decided that he would have to agree, that he decided to escalate the crisis in Ukraine in order to achieve a rise in his popularity through a sort of rallying round the flag effect in Ukraine itself. All I would say about all of that is that all of these plans that Ukraine might have had this year have clearly failed. The Russian counter-mobilization terrified Western capitals, forced a de-escalation, and Ukraine has been unable to achieve any of the objectives that it might have started out with at the beginning of this year. There's been no expansion of the Normandy 4 format. There's been no change in the Russian position on the implementation of the Minsk agreement. And of course, Zelensky's popularity in Ukraine itself continues to go south. Having said all of that, it's perhaps most interesting of all to note what Zelensky has to say about the German and French position over the course of the negotiations. And this is so remarkable that I'm going to quote what TASS has to say about his comments in full. Kozak, chief Russian delegate to negotiations by the Normandy Quartet's political advisers, has expressed regret over the stance of his German and French counterparts, who over the past 6 years of talks have been unable to make up their minds who, in their opinion, are the parties to the conflict in Donbass, although this is stated very clearly in the Minsk agreement. In an interview to the Rossiya 24 round-the-clock television news channel, Kozak cited a reply to a direct question on this issue he heard from his German and French counterparts at the latest round of contacts. They argue, "We are unable to give an answer. It is a complicated political issue. A summit meeting of the Normandy Quartet's head of state and government is to be convened to make a decision." And then Kozak goes on to say, just imagine, this happens in the 6th year following the conclusion of the Minsk agreement, after all the statements and at least 3 summits of the heads of state. The UN Security Council approved all the measures agreed in Minsk. Everybody vows allegiance to the Minsk agreement. And in the 6th year, there comes the statement, "No, we are unable to do this." The political advisors, the representatives of foreign ministries, are unable to provide an answer to a simple and clear question: although the answer is described in detail in the Minsk agreement and in the latest agreement on truce that was achieved in July last year. There is only one mention of Russia in the Minsk agreement. That is when the Russian-Ukrainian border is to be returned to Ukraine's control, and the only context in which that is to happen is after the elections, which are to be agreed between the parties at the conclusion of the process set out in the Minsk agreement. Russia, in other words, is not a party to the conflict. Well, there it is. Asked a direct question as to who they think is a party to the conflict in Ukraine, Germany and France cannot answer. The reason they cannot answer is because they cannot say, as they would love to say, that the parties to the conflict are Ukraine and Russia, because the Minsk agreement says otherwise. At the same time, they can't bring themselves to say what the Minsk agreement says, which is that it is Ukraine and the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, because doing so would let the Russians off the hook. And at that point, the whole sanctions policy that the West has been following since 2014 would be exposed as a complete nonsense. The Germans and the French, and indeed the collective West, are trapped in a bind largely of their own making. They're stuck with a sanctions policy linked to a Minsk agreement that does not say that which they would love it to say. Well, I'm going to make a prediction, which is that sooner or later the Russians will conclude that the Germans and the French are incapable of implementing the Minsk agreement, or at least getting Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreement in the way that the Minsk agreement requires. There will not be talks between Ukraine and the leaders of the two republics, as is required by the Minsk agreement, because Ukraine will never agree to that, and the Western powers will never agree to that either. At some point, the Russians will decide that the moment has therefore come for them to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics as independent countries, and at that point, as night follows day, those two republics will ask for Russian peacekeepers to be deployed to those two republics, and those peacekeepers will be so deployed. At that point, the Western powers will be forced to take the further step of imposing sanctions like disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, which they have been desperate to avoid doing. At that point, also, the Russians will have made all the preparations they need to prepare for that eventuality and to ride out any disconnection from SWIFT. In fact, the Russians have been making repeated comments and statements over the last few weeks that they are preparing for the day when they're disconnected from SWIFT, even though the Europeans have been going out of their way to say that they have no plans to disconnect Russia from SWIFT at the moment. This day will one day come. It will come very soon, probably not within the next year or so, but probably at some point within the next 5 years. At that point, the Ukrainian crisis will in effect be over, and the break in relations between Russia and the West will, to all intents and purposes, be final and complete. Whether the Western powers are prepared to shift in order to avoid that terrible eventuality taking place, we will see, but I doubt it. Anyway, that is my prediction for the future. But let us first of all take stock of this extraordinary state of affairs now. Asked about who are the parties to the Ukrainian conflict, a simple and straightforward question. The two mighty powers, or perhaps I should say once mighty powers, of Germany and France are unable to give an answer. How low have the once mighty fallen? They can't answer a simple question like that. Louis XIV, Napoleon, Bismarck, all those great leaders of Europe's past must be turning in their graves. As for the current crop of European leaders, all I can say is that they should feel ashamed. But there we are. European diplomacy has all but collapsed, and nobody should feel in the slightest bit surprised about that fact. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and our main channel that you ran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. I look forward also to you joining us on our new platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. Please also remember, to the extent that you can, to support us by going to PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And please do check out our shop and buy yourself the amazing things you will find there. Lastly, please don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and also press the like button if you like this video. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our other ones. Thank you, and have a wonderful day until then.